Welcome to this session on imagining multiple models of ministry with youth. This is a new series hosted by the Calvin Institute of Christian Worship. I am Dr. Elizabeth Tamez Mendez, Executive Director of New Generation 3 and longtime collaborator with the CICW. Today, we have the pleasure of speaking with Reverend Dr. Theresa Cho, and she's joining us for this conversation in the next video in the series. Theresa, thank you for being our guest today. We're so happy to have you here.
Oh, I'm happy to be here. Thank you for having me and providing this opportunity to have this conversation.
Thank you so much for your time. And as you know, the CICW has been working on gathering insights around this theme. We want to come together and learn about community worship practices in different contexts, especially those that encourage intergenerational worship spaces and relationships. In today's conversation, we want to focus on practices that include and empower youth. Theresa, would you please share with us a bit about your context and your work? We are eager to get to know more about it and about you.
Sure. Yeah. So I am a pastor at St. John's Presbyterian Church in San Francisco, and it is a church that is 150 years old. So it has a lot of history. I will say throughout its history, I am their first woman pastor.
Wow.
So, yeah. So that's a change. And we're kind of a small urban congregation, very focused on kind of servicing and loving our neighbors in the city through food insecurity, affordable housing, family worship, and immigrant rights. I also do a lot with youth only because my background was a teacher before I was a pastor. So I taught special education, focusing mostly older children who were on the autism spectrum. And so what I bring then to anything that I do here at St. John's, but also in my denomination, which is Presbyterian Church USA, is how do you bring the abstract? And, nothing sometimes could be more abstract than God, down to the concrete, where we get to touch it and participate in it and smell it and taste it. So a lot of my work then is working with youth on the denominational level. I had participated in Presbyterian Youth Triennium, where we gather about 5,000 youth to one area. I got a chance to write the curriculum. So they got to dive into Bible study from kids all over the United States, meeting people, intersecting with people that they would never probably have met before in their lives, and all centered around the Word of God.
Thank you so much, Theresa. This really helps us to get to know you better and to understand the spaces where you work and relate to youth. And now, before we move forward, we want to let our viewers know that to frame our conversations in this series, we have chosen 5 values to shape this project on corporate worship and models of ministry with youth. These values are youth agency, spaces for theological questions, the role of the family, sparking intergenerational relationships, and designing multiple pathways for ministry with youth. Theresa, so how has your work with youth and then your work at St. John's Presbyterian Church been able to inform the way that you create these intergenerational spaces?
Yeah, I think for me, it's really understanding what is intergenerational church, what is intergenerational worship. I think a lot of us focus on the youth and the children aspect of it. But for me, the important part of it is the inter. So where are the spaces, whether it's in worship, whether it's in ministry, whether it's in social justice, where's the intersections and the interactions between those of all ages? And how do we then learn from one another? That no matter what age we are all teachers and we're all learners. And given our age, we get a different glimpse into the wonder and awe of who God is. And therefore who we are. So a lot of what we do at St. John's is kind of creating that space where everyone has access to shape and form not only worship, but the church as well. And so that's really kind of what I focus on is less about age and more about the different ways that we learn. So some people, whether you're young or old, are more visual learners. Some are more audible learners. Some need to touch and feel everything. Some love words and long-winded sermons. We all have different ways we process, and it's not just about age. It's really about the unique ways that God has created us.
Thank you for pointing that out of how you are trying to create these spaces there at the church, right, where everything is intergenerational.
Yeah.
And there were a couple of things that jumped to me that I would love to hear more about, because you mentioned that one was having these values and ways of conceptualizing ministry where everyone is learning from one another. So if you could share with us about that, because I know that a lot of the people that we speak to and that we have conversations about these topics, they either point out to us that maybe some of the elders or older generations, they have a bit of a struggle with that concept and that notion, right? So what are some practical ways that you do that, where there's an ethos of understanding that part of my role is teaching, and younger ones can also teach me, right? And then with the young ones, the other side, where perhaps also in different cultural spaces where there's a sense of they're elders, they're to be respected, and I don't have a voice, right? And so then it's almost like the reverse teaching of you have something valuable to bring. So I don't know if you could speak about that, how you have been able to work into these aspects in your church and in worship.
I really do think intergenerational gives us an opportunity to kind of really pull at some of the myths that we hold, and not only myths, but I mean, for a lot of us, it's deep value. So I think for a lot of the older generation, we can have this idea of what is holy, and and how we worship can be holy. And for some, it may be that you have to sit a certain way, you have to act a certain way. Children should be seen and not heard. Definitely, do not bring any food or drink into the sanctuary. I mean, how many times do we see those signs at the doors of the sanctuary that says, no food or drink here? But intergenerational worship can start really testing those questions of, well, why? What happens when you bring food and drink into the sanctuary? What is of value to you in worship may actually be an obstacle to somebody else in worship. So one of the first things that we did at St. John's was I got pregnant my first year at St. John's, and my son was someone who I could not easily hand off to somebody. He had to be with me, glued to my body 24/7. So here I am, a new pastor, young, and I have to preach with him, strapped to my body, right? But that kind of gave me an insight of things that were obstacles for me as their pastor that prevented me from fully being able to lead worship there. I mean, we are a historic church. We had these beautiful historic pews, but those pews took up so much physical space. There was not room to do anything else. It was so hard to bring in a stroller. It was so hard to bring to walk around and move around, right? Those pews were meant to just stay there, which meant then the people were meant to just stay there and sit there. Well, here's one thing. Children don't just sit and stay there. They move around. So one of the first things that we just experimented with was, what if we just remove a couple of them, just so that there's at least some space where I could have a stroller, or families who needed extra things, could have space. And one of the things that we discovered was, not all the adults actually felt comfortable in that space. That when we just removed a couple of the pews, some of the older folk who were in wheelchairs or walkers said, there's now room for me here
Like,
too.
thank you.
Yeah, and it
Yeah.
opened it up to, this is not
Mhm.
just a young person problem. This is an
Mm,
intergenerational problem.
mm,
And we have now created space that no matter how young you are to how old, no matter what ability you have or what challenges you have, we are creating space for you. And so that's just like one concrete example
mhm.
of how, changing something, testing a value can really then discover ways that unintentionally a church was being unwelcoming.
Mm, mm. And I think you pointed something extremely important, right? The values and those deep values that sometimes we have not had a chance to articulate and to actually express, but
Yes,
in our mind and our imagination, this is how it is, right? It's like, and there's no
absolutely.
other way. It's like, this is how church is, this is how worship is, this is the right way to do it.
Right. And if we're ever wondering, well, what values should we start with? The perfect people to ask are toddlers, because
Mm,
what do they ask? Why? You have to do this. Why?
but
What's this? Why? They're always asking why. And oftentimes I wonder if we have the answers to their whys. And if
mm.
we don't, then that's a clue that that is probably something that we should be paying attention to. You need to sit quiet. You need to act like this. Why? This is how we worship. Why? You can't bring your goldfish crackers into the sanctuary. Why? And I think just kind of being playful with it too. I really think
Mm,
God is a creative, playful God. And that's one of the
mm,
things about intergenerational churches. It takes us to not be so serious about these things. We
mhm,
are supposed to engage and interact with one another. And that's how we learn who God
mhm.
is and who we are.
I think we often um, have been passed down this image of God, right? Where everything is just is very stern, it's very orderly, and um, how opposite I always see of how everything is created outside of that, right? Because it's like I am almost mesmerized by the chipmunks here in the birds and everything. I there's a lot of nature around here, and they're just like playful and they're happy and they're disorganized, but they know exactly where they're trying to do what their goal is. And yet somehow there's that a lot of movement and play and playfulness. And we've kind of lost that in the translation and
Absolutely.
transition, right? Where it's like what we've been telling each other these theological stories. And so then we start to see these generations and that they're growing up in this society, which is a lot more playful and open. I mean, I just spend a lot of time watching those TikTok videos, and this is what they want to do. The new generations, and now even the older ones are catching on to it. They want to be free. They want to move. They want to be playful. They want to be able to express what they have in mind, and somehow those deep values
Absolutely.
from other generations have been passed down, that there's a clash in that. And
It,
so
it no longer fits,
yes.
it no longer translates. And I think too, you know, that we run a real risk and a real danger of becoming irrelevant if
Mm,
we haven't already become irrelevant
mm, mm, mm,
already, right? And I think it's not because the church is old-fashioned. I
mm,
think it's
mm,
because there's something we do where we walk through the doors of the church, and we expect nothing to change.
mm,
That we worship a never-changing God. But if we worship a never-changing God, then really what we've created is an idol
mm, mm,
of sorts, because everything outside the doors of the church, our lives have changed.
mm,
And a
mm.
perfect example of that is what we've been going through for the past year and a half.
Yes,
Our
that's right.
lives have been turned upside down through this pandemic. We have lost loved ones. We have lost jobs. We have lost our sense of independence,
Mm,
maybe, depending on how
mhm,
you feel about the masks or vaccinations. We have lost a sense of community
mm,
because, we've been having to do so much on technology.
mhm,
Um, if the church does not then help us build up and strengthen our spiritual muscle, so that we are better able to deal with the challenges and the changes that are happening out there,
Mm-hmm.
then what are we doing?
Mm.
And so then the kids, the youth who are in that, and they see what's happening, they see, the most vulnerable, their lives being affected. And then they're looking to their church and their faith for answers for this. And they're seeing that there is a huge discrepancy behind that.
Mm-hmm.
So really an intergenerational church in worship, if it's truly intergenerational, it really is a laboratory. This is a place where we can test our doubt, test our hypotheses, be in difficult conversations, practice forgiving one another.
Mm-hmm.
If a child spills something in the sanctuary, it is an opportunity to practice grace. If someone, if things don't go perfect in worship, it is an opportunity to practice compassion. It tests really, are we only welcoming to people that are like us? Are we truly willing to welcome the other at the expense of our own comfort? That is what we need to be practicing in this laboratory of a sanctuary. Why? Because we need to be better able to do so out there. It is not easy to love our neighbor. And the best people who keep us accountable to that are the youth.
They can see through any walls or any masquerade that we want to bring forward, right? Because we feel that this is expected of us. This is how we need to show up. Yeah. I was having a conversation with a few leaders in another event yesterday, and it was very interesting to hear this leader mention that I used to have issues with being vulnerable and open to others and be transparent, because there's this sense that a leader needs to be this way and that way, and needs to show up in this manner, right? And I was like, who said it? Like, why do we continue with perpetrating, right, these ways of either being a leader or doing church or living out of Christianity, when, like you're mentioning, I always point out to people, any living organism, that's part of the reality. If you're alive, you're changing constantly. We feel that, well, maybe there's not much, but we know we go inside our biology, and everything in our system is renewing itself, and it's multiplying. Absolutely. And it's so, and even
my phone is renewing itself.
Exactly. It's like update. And so why is it that then we have held on to this notion that the living God and the representation and presentation of us as Christians, as a church, needs to be static, right? And never changing. And it's like, but that goes against what it means to be alive. If you're alive, you're changing. So if you're not changing, are you alive?
And so one of the things that we do at St. John's is we're not a programmatic church. So we don't have like, here's Christian education for kids, here's a youth group program. It really needs to be equal access to everything. So youth can be leaders, youth can be a part of planning worship. Really, it has to be an intergenerational endeavor. And so one of the things that we do, for example, confirmation isn't really only about learning kind of the liturgical calendar and knowing all of the confessions or all the things that you're supposed to learn, but we really talk about what are the issues that you're concerned with, what are you hearing out there? And the children today are the most woke when it comes to what's happening in the world. And then we talk about ways that then how that tests or intersects with our faith. And so our youth then create a statement of faith for the congregation, not their own personal statement of faith, but a community statement of faith that definitely is in line with what's happening in the world. And then they plan that worship service. They plan their own confirmation worship service, down to the liturgy and the prayers that they want, the rest of the church to participate in. And so it's through that. It's like taking what they're learning and what they're believing, and then it's giving them access and opportunity to say, okay, now how do you want this to translate to the rest of the congregation?
Okay, that's
The
really
practice of their
interesting.
confirmation.
So this is part of what you have worked into their confirmation process. Then they plan that worship service when they're finished with that confirmation process, and they're the ones who kind of say, this is what we're envisioning for this expression.
Yeah, because
Okay.
it's really kind of making it more concrete. It's not just them being passive recipients of all this information. It's
Mhm.
okay, so this is what we're learning. What story in the Bible do you think then would be a good one to then go along with the statement of faith that you all wrote? What music could we sing around that, and how do we pray around that? What interactive, maybe there's an interactive activity you want the congregation to participate in to reflect on their own statement of faith. So we talk about that, and then they have they exercise then their own sense of agency and leadership, um, and they become the teachers, for the congregation.
I have a couple of questions about that, because I think there's two things that keep coming into my mind, right? One is that there's a lot of conversations about innovation, about church reinventing itself, about being open to new ways of doing things. And at the same time, what I'm also seeing from some leaders who are trying to implement this is that even though they go to conferences and they get a lot of practical ways, like here are the 10 steps to do this and that, and then they go and try to replicate this in their congregation, in their context, and they're so frustrated because like I have the older generation and the younger generation talking to each other and working, but then they come back and they give me the same thing, or they're not really having those conversations with each other. And one of the aspects that we always bring up to them is like, so did the congregation establish this as a value that they want to live out, right? Do they understand what they're doing or why they're doing it? Do they determine that this is their mission and calling to pass on the baton of leadership, right? Were there conversations about that? And they're like, no. Okay, you see, when you try to implement techniques without having the foundational work done, right? Then this is, so I would like to hear how you went about doing that in the church. Because one of the aspects that we're always trying to point out to leaders is like, we want to see young people engage with the church, continue the work, the ministry. However, how to integrate them into these spaces of voice, of leadership opportunities, and who needs to walk alongside of them, that's where then there's a disconnect, right? Because we always try to remind them, leadership science continues to show that if you want to make the greatest impact in a person and their leadership abilities, when you have an intervention with an adult, on a good day, you have a 16% improvement in their leadership perspectives and abilities. Obviously, when you have those interventions and interactions with kids and young people, their brains are being formed, their purpose, their way of seeing things, of course, then that number grows exponentially, and they start seeing themselves as, I am vital to the church, and this is my place, and there are ways that I can give back, and we can learn from one another. But those are great concepts that makes us feel good, but then how do we go about it? But doing first the work, right, of what was the foundation that you laid out so that people would want to go along with that ethos.
Yeah, unfortunately, there are no easy 10 steps, right? I think it's recognizing a few things. It's contextual, that I can be, that my church and then maybe a church down the block, we're in the same city, we're in the same neighborhood, but we are in two different contexts. So it's very contextual to your own church. It takes time. I think that's the thing too, is we want everything to happen. Oh, what's the plan? When do we expect for this to be done? How will we know that this plan has succeeded? It doesn't work that way. I've been a pastor here at St. John's for 18 years, and we're still working. We're still making changes. We're still trying to be better at being an intergenerational church. So it takes time. Then the other thing that I would say is it's about changing people. The church are the people. And we all know it is not easy changing people. We know because we have a hard time changing ourselves.
Right. Yeah.
That's why we keep doing New Year's resolutions, and then 2 weeks later we've broken them. We can't even change our own selves. So I really do liken it back to the time when I was a teacher, a special ed teacher, and we would have we would have an IEP for each student, and then when they're working on their goals, on their individual plan, there's going to be behaviors. So there's a behavior plan. It's almost the same thing you do with a church. It's you covenant to try something. We're going to covenant to just make this one change, and then you kind of always are assessing and observing, because there's going to be behaviors. Because that's what change does. Change tugs at our sense of security. It tests our values. It makes us uncomfortable. So we can't help but have it test, have it behaviors come out, including our own.
Sure.
And so one of the things is, really kind of assessing what you're doing, so that you can figure out maybe what's a good thing for us to try to experiment with. And then you make a covenant about that. You name the fears. When we got rid of our historic pews to these movable, stackable pews, it was a 5-year conversation.
Yeah.
5-year conversation.
Tell that to a designer who comes and, we're so used to changing the layout and the furniture of a place every few months. Yeah. Wow. That's powerful. 5 years.
And because again, it's about changing people, right? And you would have thought that we were getting rid of someone's aunt, I mean, people had this nostalgic attachment to this wooden furniture. But, when we took the time, we heard from everybody, even though we still made the decision to change them out, it really was about saying, well, what are your fears about changing the pews? Oh, it's a historic church. Or some of the fears were, you change this, you're going to change everything. If you change everything, where's it going to end? Where is it going to stop? Then nothing of what I love here is going to exist anymore, And so being able to have people name what they fear, then we were able to create a covenant and go, we promise this is only about the pews. We promise open
if
communication.
If the pew's no longer useful, then I'm not going to be useful either. You're going to throw me out too.
Right. Yeah. It's not, we promise we're not getting rid of you. It's only about the pews.
Yeah.
This is kind of why we're going down this route and wanting to put forth, so much money for this endeavor. And let me tell you, so that happened in 2015. And there weren't specific things we were able to name because people wanted to know exactly why. But let me tell you, March 2020, the moment we had to go into lockdown, if it wasn't for those movable pews, within a week, we were able to turn our sanctuary into a food pantry. As people were losing jobs, as people were losing, their sense of security, we were feeding people. And it only took a week. That's holy.
Amen. Yes.
And that was an intergenerational effort. We had kids from all ages, old and young, coming to hand out food to our neighbors. So forget bringing coffee and goldfish crackers into it. We were bringing watermelon, onions, And then you see the sanctuary picture behind me.
I was going to
The
ask. So this
sanctuary
is
is still intact.
yeah. Yes.
It's still holy. It's still beautiful. It's still historic. So it's really that. It's really kind of flipping that there's no method that's going to be the secret sauce. It's about relationships. It's about loving people. And it's hard.
Yes, that is one of the factors that we constantly try to remind leaders in all of this leadership research, right? That it's the change is the hardest thing for a human being is change. And that can be a bit decentering for some of us, especially maybe of different generations, because we are so used to that. Oh, okay, so I had this phone for a few months and next one, right? And when I see some of the elders who are like, no, this is my phone for life, right? It's like, but it no longer does updates. We got to get you a new one. And so there's this whole generational change way of viewing things, and what is necessary, what is able to help us do the work for a season, but sometimes then it starts to hold us back, and it doesn't allow for the imagination and the creativity. Like you said, little did your congregation know that there was going to come a time when there was going to be this huge need in the community, and you needed to pivot quickly. And what was beautiful, very useful furniture for a long time, at this time was not going to serve you well. It was just going to start getting in the way of being able to say that the people need to get in here. And oh, thank God we have furniture that can quickly allow us to get that done.
Right. So then when we have young people come and say, do you see what's happening out there? What's the church going to do about it? We can say, well, what do you think? Let's think about that together. What should the church do about it? And have the capacity to be able to do it. That's really what we're doing. We're building capacity. We're making room for then whatever the Spirit blows, whatever God presents to us, we have the space to receive it. But if we have, if our values have created such tight borders that the Spirit can't even move, so that we can, see where new life is happening around us, then we've really kind of idolized, aspects of what we think is holy and of God. And we've really confined God. We've confined God to, to a temple, to a limited space. And so really, I don't want to devalue people's fears, because there is a sense of grief. Grief is serious. And the people needed time to grieve over those pews. Absolutely. But we can grieve and move forward at the same time.
Yeah, because it's true, right? It's not a dismissal of those things. I think it's a invitation to catch ourselves, because it's not that somebody's doing something ill-willing, or it's just sometimes we haven't had the space or the invitation to reflection, right? To say, well, why do you believe that? Why is that so important? Why is this creating noise inside of you and making you restless, right? Regardless of, like you're saying, of your age or your background. And so that's beautiful to hear that your congregation has adapted those ways of being, that it's just this conversation, knowing that it takes time, that something that for someone else may seem like, oh, well, we should just be able to get this done quickly, honoring everyone, right? That well, it may take you 5 minutes to make the decision, and it may take others 5 years, right? To come to terms to, why is this happening, and why do we all want to do it now, right?
Yeah. And that we're doing it together. That's the thing too. I mean, we're not doing it alone. We're a community doing this together. And so if we feel that we don't have the skill set, well, that's fine. Someone in the community does. If we're doubting whether this is a good idea, that's okay. Someone is just a little bit more certain than we are that maybe could give us the faith and confidence.
Yes.
One of the biggest gifts, I think, as older folks in the congregation is to just allow it to happen. Permission. Permission can be the greatest gift that you give. You may not want to participate. You may not be able to participate in this new direction, but if you can give support and permission, sometimes that is the best thing for kids and youth.
Yes, and I think part of what we always encourage the elders is to create this view of their sense of calling as those who leave a legacy and pass on the baton, right? And practice these biblical, theological values of knowing that the elders are being called and meant to teach the youngers. There's no other way for the younger generation to learn. It has to be the elders teaching the youngers, and to be able to then embrace that calling as a new season in life comes. Like you're saying, perhaps I may not be able to participate in a lot of things, or I may not be able to understand all of it, but can I bless this congregation in this church with a ministry and posture of legacy passing, right? Of being able to give the tools and enabling, and even just the not just, that's huge when you bless them and you say, I bless you, and I'm here and I'm praying. We have several elders in our congregation, and what they are always doing, they said, look, I cannot move much. They're in their 90s. I can't do much, late 80s. It's like, what I can do is to make sure that when I wake up at 3 or 4 in the morning, because I can't sleep anymore, I'm praying for this young person and this other person. Is like they have their list of names, right? It's like, and their handwriting is not very strong anymore because they're older, but yet they take these big cards and they make sure they write 2 or 3 words of affirmation for someone else in the church, especially the young ones, and they mail it out, right? And so these things that just let us know constantly that it's like we are interconnected, and the elders play a huge role in saying, we bless you to continue the work, right? Versus no, because this is changing and this is making me uncomfortable and I don't understand it. And it's a natural reaction, right? But then that invitation to how do we view, right, our sense of legacy. And I think then, like you're saying, those multi-generational relationships, to be able then to continue feeding into that, and that then kind of flows into everything else.
Well, and how do we know, what God looks like and who God is, if it's not within our faith community? And so, as you always hear the church mourning, where are the young people? Why aren't they coming back to church? But, if what they remember of church is nothing of what they want to know of God, then why would they come back? But if they can remember, I didn't do it right. I didn't do it eloquently, but my church created space and gave me opportunities to be myself, to lead in worship. I felt loved. I was prayed for. They accepted me, mistakes and all. Then that is something that could stay with them, for a long, long time, of who God is.
And it becomes addictive, right? In all these aspects of leadership development, we're always pointing out is that organizational culture, right? And so in this case, our culture as a congregation, what type of message are we constantly giving with our attitudes, with our behavior, with the things we say, with the things we allow or don't allow? They're giving constant messages, right? And so no one wants to be in an environment where they feel rejected or you're not valued valued, or this is not the place for you, or your ideas or way of doing things, that's just the, there's that step back, right? And so how do we check ourselves to make sure that even unintentionally we might be giving that message to young people? And sometimes that's a big paradigm shift, because society is still in that transition of, oh, well, young people taking over, especially in congregations and older structures, right? So how has your congregation been able to open up and unfold into this, to this transparency and the value of vulnerability, and saying that's okay if it doesn't come out perfect, if you were going to do this participation or the other and it didn't turn out fine, that's okay, you're safe here, we value you, we trust you, we are so happy that you did this. And how have you been able to create that type of energy and community values that are open to those ways of doing things?
I will say, I'll just reiterate again, it just takes a lot of time. But I think too, for me, it was just modeling that as well, modeling that, especially as we were, having more and more kids in worship, and something would get spilled, or oftentimes I would have kids who wanted me to pick them up as I'm giving my sermon, to kind of model that it's okay. See, and worship continued. It's okay, that can happen. And, and that way people could be like, okay, maybe this is something that either I can copy or I disagree with. So I'm going to have a conversation about it. And you really just want those conversations to happen, because I think when people share their stories, then it's transforming. When you are more able to know somebody's story, you will have a harder time to maybe stick so much, to your values. And one of the things that I'll share is when we were really discerning to become a sanctuary church to advocate for immigrants, one of the myths and one of the fears that people held was, if we advocate for immigrants, are we not advocating for, criminals? Because there was that reputation of some sort. And we were able to tell stories within our congregation of ways that we have been criminalized purely because of our identity. And not because of anything that we had done wrong. And so a congregation member shared how there's his brother, because he was on the autism spectrum, and he was having a behavior because something triggered it. The ways that that their city handled it was they called the police. And so then that police handled it in a situation that ultimately, unfortunately, ended in the death of his brother. And so it really kind of opened up this conversation of, oh, wait a minute, this isn't what we thought it was going to be. And it kind of opened up this opportunity to kind of transform our sense of thinking to be more inclusive and more welcoming, that we never thought of before. So again, I think opportunities that people can share their own stories, not just how are you doing, how's the weather, but really ways that they can find, oh, I thought we were different. It turns out we have more similarities than I thought we did. It can be transforming.
Yeah, because that, and I think I hear a lot of people wanting to do that, desiring to do that. I think there's been a lot of the conversation, thankfully, has been about sharing story and being able to tell one another what is going on. And I maybe perhaps because I have the comparison and contrast of the different cultural values and ways of being. When I speak of that in a Latina church, everybody's like, yeah, we do testimonies all the time, and we tell you everything that happened and what God did in my life this week and what I'm struggling with, and would you pray for this, and I'm praising God for that. But when I say that in more mainstream culture, that concept of being transparent and vulnerable and open and telling other people my business, it's not quite accepted as much. So how have you been able to negotiate those things?
I did a worship series on stories. We did origin stories, creation stories, love stories, even kind of the shameful stories, right? And we looked at stories within our church and then paired it with Bible stories. But then I gave a prompt to them. So one of them was our origin stories. So where we began, and the prompt was the first time I ever ... And it's a very innocent and approachable prompt, right? So people shared, you know what, the first time I ever ate sushi, blah, 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 blah. The first time I got on an airplane. The first time I met my baby, right? And they got to write these down, and we created a story wall. So oftentimes I think you don't have to make it harder than it is, you know. And then, you know, when it came to love stories, it was just, I love ... Kids were like, I love pizza. And other people were like, got more profound and deep about it. And, you know, and then to place it where it's accessible for people to then read, you know, as the worship series grew, really kind of gave an interesting, you know, conversation during coffee fellowship hour, and opportunities to be like, you know what, you and I have been going to this church for 20 years. I had no idea that, you know, blah, 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 you know, and it gives opportunity for intergenerational conversations too. I like pizza too. What's your favorite kind of pizza, you know? But it's that it doesn't, we don't have to make it harder than it is, really. But I think, again, creating access, creating opportunity, letting the kids lead, because oftentimes they're the ones that have the least problem with change.
Yes. And they can help us, right? They can help us to see us like, it's okay, it's not so threatening.
They can, you know, especially if, you know, as adults, we get very self-conscious about things, and you might be self-conscious of, oh my gosh, I have to write something very profound. And then you got a kid who drew pizza. It's like, I guess I don't have to be that profound. Okay, I like pepperoni pizza, you know. We just sometimes need to get out of our way a little bit.
And so then the exercise was to do these stories, and did I catch that right? Then the stories were posted throughout the building,
we
and then
kind of like like the fellowship hall, or just a place where people kind of pass and intersect and gather. Yeah.
And then it just prompted those conversations, right? And
it did. And then when you can intersect that with the church's story, you know, do you know, you know, so talking about 150 years ago, the origins of this church, and then we paired it with the creation story, and you know, and out of void and darkness, you know, God created all of the stuff, and so you know, and that was the first time. So then what was your first time? And so again, where our story and the Bible story and then our faith community, those stories can intersect, you will be surprised what profound transformation can happen.
I think that you pointed that very important concept of intersection, right? And the more we're able to create those spaces and those opportunities for the conversation, for the work together, for even seeing each other in the same space, right? Because like you were mentioning, there's churches whose structure is very much about department this, and then they don't get to see each other much. And so how do we more and more integrate, even from the little things to the big things, where we are seeing each other, and then it just feels normal that we're talking to one another, that we're giving the ideas, and not, why is this? I
Yeah.
always have this image in my mind of how things have changed, when I'm out at the airports and constantly traveling before the pandemic, and I would see a lot of kids at the airport, and over the years I've seen the shift in reaction when I say, "Hi, how you doing? What are you going? What's going on? Where, what are you playing with?" From where it used to be these open conversations, kids telling me what was going on, to now looking at me like, why is an adult speaking to me? And I'm busy watching my video, right? And to them, it's just like, an adult is talking to, like, they're just like, they're mind blown, right? And then they have no idea what to say or how to react, because they're growing in these spaces where they don't think adults and younger ones speak, right? And so
Yeah,
to them it's just like,
absolutely. And
what?
and I think oftentimes we talk at children, we don't talk to
Mm,
them or with them. And I think as adults, I think we have those same experiences of when we've been talked at,
mm,
and it doesn't feel good, you know? And so what does it then mean to honor the child, and talk to them, talk with them? Because that's what we would want for ourselves.
mm. Being able to just recognize that they are a human being with agency, with lots to say, and depending on your theological background, the way I always share with leaders is say, um, Jesus made no distinction on the ages, right? It's like, to the contrary, he said, hold on, the disciples are telling everyone, it's like, no, Jesus is busy, can't bless your child, please leave him
Yeah.
alone. And he's like, wait, here is backwards in the kingdom. It's like, my way of doing, no, my leadership is they come first, we take care of them first, and then the rest, well, if we get to it, great, and if not, then that's it, right? But I think just being able to continue to translate that into the church. And I did want to ask you about, when you see these intergenerational relationships, what has been the reaction of the parents, the grandparents, the family members, or any other guardians? What have you seen in this process?
Well, it's a shift for them too. I think, moving from kind of that, you know, um, older style of Christian education where we, segregate the children, right? So you have worship, and then you have the children's sermon, and then oftentimes then they go off to have their separate programming, right? And so then what that says is their spiritual formation is in the hands of the church.
Mm.
The problem with that is you only see them for an hour a week, maybe, if they come every Sunday, maybe. Who are the people that see them all the time? It is their parents. And so the shift is then teaching guardians and parents and family members, you are their number one spiritual formation teacher. And so it shifts then from teaching kids, the facts of the Bible stories, to teaching parents how to, and giving them the resources on how to teach their children, teaching them how to pray, teaching, what are the spiritual rituals and practices that you can do on a daily basis. When those conversations, those God conversations come up, how can we structure them and form them so that, we're having, so that we know what to say, and I don't have to feel like I have to know all the answers. One of the things I used to do in church all the time that made the parents nervous is when I did have conversations with the kids, and when the kids would ask a difficult question, I said, that's a great question. You should ask your parents about that. Oh, no. But
counting on you to do all the work of the faith formation. You're the
so
pastor.
it really did. Yeah. So it shifted then again from then providing then materials and resources for parents, that we would provide things in worship. It was for kids to do, but it really was a tool for them to take home with their kids and to continue the conversation and continue the practice throughout the week. And so that's a hard shift.
Yes, because again, right, part of the legacies we have received, but we really haven't thought about that. Okay, well, the spiritual formation of my child is the responsibility of the church, right, and the ministers and the structures within it. And
and the kids will ask, the kids will say, why are you making me do this when I never see you do this?
Right. It's like, that's the great thing about being with the younger ones. They call out on us constantly. They're just kind of like, what you're saying and what you're doing is not matching. Like, hold on, why, right? And so you and I as educators and that technique of asking the same question 5 times, right? I think we probably got it from toddlers. It's like, but why? And this, but why? And they're not, like, we give them an answer and they're just not. And so I think that's always a good technique for us as leaders. Make sure you ask the same question 5 times. And you're going to get to the bottom of things.
Every church should know why they exist. You know, why does St. John's exist on the corner of Lake Street and Arguello Boulevard? And if you can't answer that, then that is a starting place for you.
And being able then to understand even within that why, right, with the intersection with families and to be able to see that certainly we're walking alongside of you as partners and collaborators in the development and faith formation of this child. However, the blessing and the responsibility has been given by God to you, not to the pastor, not to Sunday school teacher or to the youth leader or the children's minister. It's certainly that privilege and responsibility of the parent to be able to guide them in the right direction, so that even when they're older and they're old, they will stick to what they have learned. And but I know for a lot of parents that can be baffling. It's like, how do I do that? Because they may not have had an example of that growing up, right? And it's like that formation. So if I understood, then your congregation creates resources to help the parents in that process, or is there something that you purchase?
Yeah, it's morphed over the years in different ways, but it's really just, like I said, considering putting together a guide that, so we used to, before the pandemic, I don't know what we're doing right now, but before the pandemic, we would have a worship bulletin that, would follow, the regular worship bulletin, but it gave prompts to the parents, so when we're singing this hymn, it would give a prompt to the parent to say, have your child recognize how many times this word pops up in the hymn, or if we had a coloring page that went along with, the scripture that was being read, have, see if they can color that character or whatever as they're hearing the scripture. How does it come alive to them? And so it was really just simple prompts for parents to have faith conversations with their children.
And does that mean then that there needs to be a little bit of a different flow in the worship space if a parent needs to interact with your child during the worship service and help them guide through those prompts? Has that made then a difference in how things go?
Over time, really our worship service became a place where went from what I described my first year at St. John's to now 18 years later. There's constant movement in the sanctuary, mainly because kids can't stay still, but there are people where an hour is a long time to not go to the bathroom. Yes. Or they want to refresh their coffee. And because we kind of always say that caffeine enhances worship 100 times better. But Again, the sense of permission of just kind of being, what does it mean to be present in worship? And that sense of movement gives parents also permission to get down on the floor, next to their child if they have to, or, have a quiet conversation with their child to kind of guide them through whatever bulletin we were providing, or if there was an activity in the middle of our sanctuary that the kids were invited to participate in. So that's really kind of where we've moved to now. So you don't really notice that. And that's kind of one of the things that we hold as a part of our identity. So we do have people, we want to be welcoming and hospitable, but if that is not something that you're looking for, then St. John's may not be the right congregation for you.
Sure, because we know that everyone has different needs and may not be maybe at that time in the spot to be open to those types of dynamics they may have in their imagination, that it needs to be a lot more rigid, or the pace of it or the noise of it needs to be in a different tone, right? And so and we know this, and that's great, and that's why there's so many different types of ministries, right? But I think, like you're saying, knowing our context and knowing the temperature, right? How much can be done at this time, perhaps later something else can be done, right? And then just that gradual integration.
And we follow the same structure, every Sunday, but one may be more, we may be a little bit more traditional, but then the next one may be a little bit more interactive. And so what the congregation has developed is kind of this capacity to say, oh, well, this may not be necessarily resonating with me, but I know next Sunday there might be, and it kind of, again, it's that permission. It's that creating space that just because it's not resonating with me doesn't mean it's not resonating with somebody in this congregation. And so kind of this sense of generosity that it's not all about me.
Yeah, because that's been hard, right? Again, part of the legacy that we received, we started shifting at some point to where church needs to give you what you want, and this is about your needs being filled, and are you receiving what you need? And if not, go somewhere else, right? And it's just this sense of the church is here to serve me, and it has. Yes, of course, there is part of that, but I think sometimes we have taken it to the extreme, right? And it's almost, we have this view of the church and the body of Christ and us coming to worship almost like I'm going to a restaurant or a business and they need to give me what I want, the way I want it, how I want it. And it's just one of those things where it's like, this is different. This is about God, and this is about sometimes it may not connect with me, but like you're saying, it's like I'm praying then that in that moment it will be connected with someone else that needs to hear it in this way or do it in that way. Or so, if I'm understanding correctly, then your church doesn't have a dynamic of separate, different worship services styles, and there's
no, I mean we don't, and it's not that at moments we do. I mean, I do think there are, definite benefits at times to having something that's just geared, that's age specific. Yes. Absolutely. But it's not programmed to always be that way. It's meant to, if it makes sense at that time, that's what we're going to do, especially, if you're doing a worship series that isn't maybe age appropriate, then you're going to want to be very sensitive to that. So again, I think to kind of get us out of this cookie cutter mold that it has to be this way. But no, instead giving us a sense of permission and freedom. Again, it's the teacher and me. It's creating that lesson plan. It's like, what do I want people to walk away with?
Sure.
And depending on what that is, that lesson and how that's going to be taught is going to be different.
Yeah, yeah. And I think like you pointed that out, that freedom to say, this is what seems to be needed today. This is where the spirit is leading. This is where today might need to be more about the olders, and today might be about the youngers, right? And one of the things that I always share with other leaders, you'll be surprised how when you think, oh, this is going to be so boring for kids, they're not going to want to do this. We set up those spaces and those expectations for them, and they rise up to it, and they're happy to know that, oh, I'm able to be in this space as well, and it doesn't always have to cater to the children, right? And then they start understanding and learning, this is what's expected of me in this other space and place.
Well, and to be able to look at children for who they are individually and not because they're children and therefore I think all children need this. I mean, we had a kid who grew up in our church, and I swear by the time he was born, he was ready to run for president. And
yeah, right.
I mean, I can't tell you, like the first time he co-preached with me, and I'm serious about this, co-preached with me, he was in third grade. I mean, he was articulate, he knew what he wanted. And then you have kids, who are more, artistic and more visual. But I think that's the same with adults. I think you have adults who have a sense of ability to articulate what they believe. And then you have those who are just like, I'm here because I know I belong. Other than that, I haven't figured anything out.
Yeah. Yeah, and there's those different needs, and even at different times, because those change. But I know we're getting close to wrapping up our time, but you just touched on something so important. You brought up this concept of co-preaching. So
Yeah.
you wanna close with that? You want to tell us about how that works and why you're doing it, and how have the youngers and olders reacted to that?
Yeah, I think it depends on kind of whatever the worship series or the topic we had, but there'll be certain kids that I'll ask to, and youth, I'll ask to co-preach with me, and it's great. I'll ask their parents' permission. Hey, can I pick so-and-so up after school? And we'll go to an ice cream shop, and we're going to kind of hash out our sermon together. And I've had, as young as third grade to middle school and to youth. And it can be as short and simple. It could be a story, but the important part is not necessarily what we say, but it's that time at the ice cream shop where I'm having this conversation with them going, hey, so I want to read you this Bible story. Let's talk about this a little bit. Is there something is something in your life that you can relate to? Oh, you're kidding. Oh, so I wonder if you could tell that story then. Let's try and write that out together. And then we do, and then we share that, as a part of the sermon illustration, worship.
And I think that probably takes you longer, right? And more effort than if you were just preparing the sermon by yourself.
Sometimes it does and sometimes it doesn't. You got those moments where you need longer than a week, and come Sunday morning, you're like, I still have nothing to say. Lord Jesus, may you speak through me today. I think it just depends. Yeah.
And I think something that I am always bringing up is it's been very interesting how in marketing and in this other world, in the world of business, there has been that transition. One of the big retailers started then making the shifts. The marketing campaigns and even the marketing companies that they were hiring changed because they understood, okay, so every year our biggest sales have to do with Christmas and going back to school. So who is the target demographic? Is the children. Who should be selling these products? The children, right? And so they shifted their whole marketing strategy to where young teenagers are the ones directing and writing the stories and doing the whole production of it. And it shifted from, we're not trying to sell you a pen or a backpack or a notebook. It's all these stories of kids telling how, yeah, I felt so lonely at school. And then, we just sat down and I met this girl and I didn't know who she was, but we noticed we had the same backpack. So then we started going off and talking, right? And I no longer feel alone. And somehow business has been able to understand that
Yeah,
if we
no,
want to
absolutely.
attract
Well,
it's
and,
these connections with their real life day to
and,
day.
and
How can the church
guaranteed,
do this?
yeah, exactly. And guaranteed, if you ask any pastor, if they've had a congregation member come up and go, I didn't understand anything in your sermon, but man, that children's sermon blew me away. Totally got it. And that's the point. It's like, yeah, so then to co-preach with a child, it's not to bring up the Q factor.
Mm.
There's something profound in that,
Mm.
as adults, we all can admit the Bible is not the easiest thing to understand, which is probably why the children's sermon makes more sense than the sermon. That, and we just need to write better sermons. But but again, it's intergenerational church and worship. It's not about dumbing down. It really is about honoring all the different ways that we take in information and are in relationship, and that includes with God.
And the reality of everyday life, right? And that someone else, regardless of their age, is going to be able to bring a different application or reflection about it, and the impact in that young person's or child life or even adult, right? It's like they will never ever forget that they were co-preaching with you.
Yeah.
And that the congregation was open to that and was attentive to them, and that they got the biggest message of any, that you belong here. You're important here. And so important that you have that space for preaching that is untouchable, right?
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Theresa. I know that I sensed it when we first started talking that we could stay here like for hours. But this was such an engaging conversation. Thank you for sharing your gifts with us today, for sharing about what God is doing in your context. We have learned so much from you today. Thank you for being a light and just showing different ways of being able to continue building faith in different spaces with different people, intergenerational relationships. And thank you so much for joining us today.
Oh, well, thank you, Elizabeth, for this opportunity. It's been a joy.
Thank you. And we also want to thank our viewers for joining us in this session of Imagining Multiple Models of Ministry with Youth. We pray these conversations inspire and encourage your efforts in reaching the next generation. And please join us for the next video in the series. And we really would love for you to leave us a comment and continue this conversation about the session. We want to hear from you. Thank you.